Hello, my name is Kirk McKenzie. I'm the author of a book on the monetary system called Money, Defending Your Prosperity. Today I'll be talking about the monetary system in the United States and its pivotal role in the momentous events that are taking place in our country and our world today. Effectively, I'm talking about the future of our nation and of the world at large. The problems are abundant and evident. We have growing unsustainable debts. We have a declining currency. We are becoming economically subordinated to other countries through our debts. And we have one generation now who is not going to live the American dream. We have to understand the difference between causes and effects. What I've just described are the effects, but what really is at the root of these problems? And I would suggest that one of those fundamental concerns is the monetary system, the topic of today's seminar. A little bit about me. I am a citizen of the United States. I am an ordinary citizen. I have degrees in business and engineering. 20 years ago, I began to conduct my own personal private investigation to understand the world and why the United States continues to decline. The solutions are obvious that they did not happen. The problems only grow bigger. Congress has completely failed in its efforts to improve the American dream. So I decided to pursue a different alternative concept, that perhaps the world was not just drifting, but was being driven in a particular direction. And I decided to follow the money. My book is the result of my 20-year personal investigation into this topic, as well as the companion booklet, the handbook that goes into your pocket, which also provides quotes and information taken from the main book. We'll start with Chapter 1, Basic Concepts about a Monetary System. And we'll start back in antiquity. If we go back to the old days, even before money exists, we have barter. And what's shown here is a small village with each circle representing a person in that village. And the method for actually exchanging goods and services was a direct exchange between the two parties. Goods for goods, goods for services. The problem with this approach in every country at every time is it does not scale. Once the population exceeds that of a small tribe or a small village, barter simply becomes an ineffective way to conduct commerce. And over the centuries and throughout the world, the solution was a third commodity that people would accept in exchange. We now had a three-way exchange. Individuals would get together to exchange goods for services, but they would actually use a third good as the unit for exchange. And this solved a lot of the problems with barters. At its root, money is a third commodity. It is a commodity which people accept. There are some ideal characteristics of a money supply or a monetary unit. First among those is the people must accept it. It must have universal acceptance to be effective. It has to be divisible to the smallest unit. For example, you have to be able to buy an egg or a stick of gum with the money. And yet it has to have enough scarcity to have value. The more scarce a commodity is, the more valuable it is. Hence, diamonds are more valuable than gold, and gold is more valuable than silver. It's also important that money be convenient and it be counterproof. Now, convenience is a two-edged sword, and as we'll develop through the remainder of this presentation, we'll come to an understanding that convenience is costing us our freedom and our liberty. An example of a monetary unit of exchange that was historically used was salt. The Romans used salt to pay their soldiers, hence the terminology of pence of salt or salary. Universally, gold and silver became primary units for money, primary commodities that would be acceptable to the masses for the money. And indeed, the U.S. Constitution lays down the principle in Article 1, Section 2, No state shall emit bills of credit. Now, bills of credit are paper money, Federal Reserve notes, if you will. And shall not make anything but gold and silver coin at tender and payment of debts. The Constitution has never been amended. It is very clear that the only currency that is authorized by the Constitution is gold and silver, not paper. This was not just a mere choice, it was a bedrock principle. It was indeed understood that this was the foundation of liberty. There can be no question that this was the intent of the Founding Fathers. Here we have George Washington, the first President of the United States. Quote, "Paper money has had the effect in your state that it will ever have, to ruin commerce, oppress the honest, and open the door to every species of fraud and injustice." George Washington continues, "We may become a great commercial and flourishing nation, but if in the pursuit of the means we should unfortunately stumble again on unfounded paper money or any similar species of fraud, we shall assuredly give a fatal stab to our national credit in its infancy." We note in his remarks here that he equates paper money to a fraud. The second President of the United States, John Adams, is likewise clear. "Banks have done more injury to the religion, morality, tranquility, prosperity, and even wealth of the nation than they can have done or ever will do good. All the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arise not from defects in their Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, so much as downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. Indeed, this is the problem that we are addressing today. If our liberties are to be returned and we are to end the financial insanity, we the people must become deeply acquainted with how our monetary system affects these issues. Finally, the third President of the United States, another Founding Father, again makes it abundantly clear what their intent was in drafting the Constitution. "I sincerely believe," he said, "that banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity is but swindling futurity on a large scale. If we American people ever allowed monopoly banking to control the issue of currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, these banks and bureaucracies that will grow up around them will deprive we, the people, of all our property until our children will wake up homeless on the continent which God gave us for our stewardship." It could not be a more clear statement of intent. We return now to our historical evaluation of the development of money. In the village we return to, an individual becomes the keeper of the gold, someone who brings gold into the community, keeps a ready supply of it, helps people to keep and exchange the gold. As part of that process, that person also stores gold. Like the blacksmith is named for his trade, this person becomes known as goldsmith, and then we shall refer to him by name throughout our examples. Depositors were those who had excess gold to safeguard. Now they could put them in the mattress, they could bury them in a pot in their property, but over time a number of them would actually give them to the goldsmith who had the means and the safes to protect the gold. And furthermore would give them assurance that if the gold were robbed, nonetheless the gold would be redeemed. As evidence of the deposit, goldsmith would provide a piece of paper to the depositor, a receipt. Now the receipt was evidence of a debt, of an obligation of goldsmith to the depositor, effectively saying, "I will give you your gold back whenever you want it." This was a promise of redemption. It was an obligation of goldsmith. The original obligation clause might read something like this: "Payable to John Blacksmith, So the receipt now specifies the name of the depositor, 8.5 ounces of gold, the exact amount that was on deposit, and payable on demand, meaning that you could have it back whenever you wanted it. In time, these gold receipts became easier to circulate between people rather than an individual going to redeem their gold, conducting a trade in gold, and then only have the other person potentially take the gold to Goldsmith and deposit and get a receipt in their name. It became easier to countersign these receipts to each other. These receipts began to circulate as money. To facilitate this change, the obligation clause wording was modified. And here is an example. It's now payable to bearer. Whoever has the receipt has the right to the gold. 1 ounce of gold, we now have standard denominations. And again, on demand. Now, Goldsmith charged a storage fee for storing this gold. Let's take as an example that he has on deposit 1,000 ounces of gold. And he charges a fee of 3% per year for safeguarding the gold and providing assurance that it would be redeemed, irrespective of whether it was stolen. So Goldsmith's annual income for this fee would be 30 ounces of gold, or 3% of the 1,000 ounces of gold. In time, these gold receipts would develop into currencies. And here is an example. This is a gold certificate, evidenced by the gold seal, showing there that it is redeemable in gold. Now, there's a lot of design work on here, but it's the words that are of most importance to us, because those words are what create a legal obligation. And if we take the different designs and all different sizes and all the different fonts, and we actually pull them out of that bill, then what we're going to discover is the following legal statement. This certifies that there have been deposited in the Treasury of the United States of America $20 in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. The reason for these called certificates is there was actually gold there for redemption, and it was certified the gold was there. The amount of paper in circulation could not exceed the amount of gold that was in deposit. Now, in time, it became evident to Goldsmith that only 10% of the amount of gold that was on deposit was actually needed for daily redemptions. Approximately 90% of that gold simply sat in his safe, day in and day out. This led Goldsmith to come up with a scheme. He would lend out 900 ounces of the gold at 7% interest. He would hold 100 ounces in reserve, and so he would now have his 10% deposit, or his 10% reserve, to cover the daily demand, but he would have the other 900 ounces out earning income. That income, his total income, now increases to 93 ounces of gold per year. 30 ounces for a storage fee, he's charging Goldsmith even though he's no longer storing the gold, and 63 ounces for the interest he's charging for the use of that gold. Now, we would call this embezzlement and conversion. The banks call this putting our money to work. They also call this fractional reserve banking. It is the basis of the Federal Reserve. Now, in this scheme, the borrowers would sign promissory notes. These were legal obligations to labor on behalf of Goldsmith over a period of time and eventually return the gold with interest. They are a form of indentured servitude. It is interesting to note now that the relationship is somewhat flipped. These pieces of paper represent obligations from individuals to Goldsmith versus the other way around. The word mortgage, which everyone is familiar with, comes from the French. The word mort means death, and the word gage means pledge. Now, these were obligations, as I mentioned, of the borrower towards the lender. In addition to the promises to labor for Mr. Goldsmith, the borrowers are also obliged to pledge, for example, their homes. And those are your deeds of trust, to make sure that you, in fact, completed the labors. If you did not, the home would be taken and it would be put in the hands of somebody else who would labor for Mr. Goldsmith. This is scheme one. Now, in time, the scheme was enhanced. Here's scheme two. In this scheme, Goldsmith would keep all 1,000 ounces of gold on deposit in the safe. Instead, he would lend out 9,000 ounces at 7%. Now, how much, you ask, could he lend out 9,000 ounces? Because he only has 1,000 ounces of gold in the vault, and those coins are being kept there. And the answer was paper. The scheme involved the issuance of duplicate gold certificates or gold receipts that would circulate. Now, these were unbacked by gold. Nonetheless, he still had his 10% reserve, and as long as the demands, daily demands for reserves did not exceed this amount, he would not be caught. If he was, this was what's called a run on the bank, or a bank panic. We now have 10,000 pieces of paper, or 10,000 receipts in circulation that are based upon that 1,000 ounces of gold that sits in his vault. 10 people now have the same claim on the gold that was deposited originally by Mr. Blacksmith. Now, we would call this pyramid scheme. If we take a look at the obligation side, the borrowers still sign their promissory notes. They still hand over their deed of trust to their homes, for example. It's a wonderful deal for Goldsmith. Now let's just kind of look at it at this point. His income now is 660 ounces of gold per year. He still gets his 3% storage fee from Goldsmith on the 1,000 ounces, and he's getting a 7% interest on the 9,000 pieces of paper he's printed. In other words, he's making now a 66% return on the gold he does not own, but simply holds. In addition, he has 9 indentured servants who are promised to labor for him. In our current modern day, that would be a labor of 30 years in exchange for that home mortgage. And he has 9 homes pledged as security. All of this is based upon simply holding somebody else's money. Now, there was a problem with this scheme because if he were caught issuing duplicate certificates, it obviously was fraud. So the third and ultimate scheme, he keeps the gold. He still lends out 9,000 ounces at 7%, but he now lends out something called a banknote. This is a piece of paper issued by the bank, printed and issued by the bank. He no longer is issuing duplicate certificates, and these banknotes are not redeemable in gold. The borrowers still sign the promissory notes. They still hand over the deeds of trust to their homes or other security. And Mr. Goldsmith is still doing very well. Now, this process is called debt monetization. Notice that the way that the money is, these 9,000 pieces of paper are issued into circulation is because somebody borrows them at interest. They are an obligation of the public at large, an obligation to the bank. In exchange for a piece of paper, somebody has signed over indentured servitude and the effective ownership of their property that they lien or put over as an asset. This is the basis, again, of our monetary system today. It is a debt monetized monetary system. Now, debt monetization is worth a little discussion. Here we have a bar representing the real wealth of a nation. Let's suppose all the land, all the buildings, the automobiles, etc. Real things, the things that we consider to be wealth. And at the same point in time, we have a money to supply, somewhat like this, in balance with the real wealth. And then the value of our currency, or our dollar, in fact, has a given value. Now, the issue here is as the money supply grows, in order to fund the growth of the nation, under a debt monetized system, the debt must also grow. It's axiomatic. You cannot have money without debt. Increasing debt is built into our monetary system today. All debts, whether they are debts of the federal government or state government or corporation or our own debts, all debts are eventually paid for and borne by the people. Payment of these debts collapses the money supply. Again, payment of the debts collapses the money supply. You cannot pay off the national debt without imploding our monetary system and thereby affecting our economy, at least not under the current monetary system. Despite what the politicians would like to promise, no matter how well intended, this is a fundamental fact that the American people must understand. Now let's return to our analysis. We have 10,000 in circulation. 9,000 of these are banknotes. In addition, we have 1,000 in gold certificates, and we have 1,000 ounces of gold that are held in reserve. Now that reserve is called the monetary base, or in current technology or economic terms, that's called MB. There are multiple currencies that are circulating. We have gold certificates, and we have banknotes. This represents the problem for the bankers. Their objective, of course, is to get their banknotes accepted. Having obtained acceptance for their banknotes, their objective is to eliminate all other currencies because they compete with their banknotes. How does this happen? This is the Unholy Alliance. The monarchs always want more money. You know, they had more wars, they wanted more power, they wanted more people that reported to them, whatever. They were constantly short of money. Goldsmith came to the monarchs with a scheme. You can have all the money you want. Just make my legal notes tender. And I will loan you all the money you need. Now, getting all the money sounded pretty good to the monarchs, but an obvious question is, well, wait a minute, I don't have gold or silver, I want more. How does borrowing this from you work? How can I pay off the loan? And Goldsmith's reply was, no problem. Just give me the power of taxation and you won't have to pay. The people will. I call those the twin towers of modern finance or modern banking. A debt-monetized monetary system and an income tax. Now the monarchs agree with this scheme. They declare banknotes a fiat currency. Fiat meaning let it be, or in other words, the people must accept these. Whereas gold and silver were voluntarily accepted for their inherent value, throughout time, paper is forced upon the people and by government edict are forced to take it. There's no longer any supply constraint. These can be printed at any volume. And the monarchs get all the money they need, and they get it up front. Let's suppose in today's language we say $1 trillion. The federal government wants $1 trillion. No problem, $1 trillion can be printed. And they get that up front. The people, on the other hand, are the ones that foot the bill. They did not understand what was happening. They're not aware of this relationship between these debts and an increase in the monetary supply and the devaluation of their currency. The transaction was primarily invisible to them. And furthermore, the impact was not immediate. Although the monarch gets $1 trillion today, the people only see the interest portion of that debt as the current increase in their tax obligations. So it's kind of a creepy crawly development, and they're not fully aware of this, but year after year after year, it grows like a snowball going downhill. And eventually people become increasingly uneasy, but still don't necessarily understand the system or what causes it. Now, because it's not an immediate and it's somewhat hidden from them, there was no revolt like there would have been had the monarchs tried to increase their income through increased taxation. As I mentioned, these are the two towers of modern banking. In Lenin, we take a quote, "The way to crush the bourgeoisie is to grind them between the millstones of taxation and inflation." Does that sound familiar? In 1913, it is not coincidental that these three things passed. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution purportedly gives the federal government the right to impose a federal income tax on the people. This is in response to a Supreme Court ruling in the 1890s that declared that a federal income tax was unconstitutional, arguing that the power to tax was the power to destroy. The 16th Amendment purportedly put that power into place. That's questionable at this point, but let's continue. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution changed the way that the senators would be nominated. According to the original Constitution, the people would be represented by the House of Representatives, who they would elect by popular vote. The states would be represented directly in the federal government and have a hand in the federal government's direction, because the senators would be nominated or elected by the choice of the state legislatures. The 17th Amendment eliminated the state involvement and made the election of the senators by popular vote. And finally, the Federal Reserve Act created a permanent central bank. The consequences of these were a fundamental transformation of our country. The states were completely dealt out of the federal government at this point in time. They were replaced by the Federal Reserve Bank, in effect. We can see that in the following way. Here's the original structure. We have a federal government, we have the states, we have the people. The people pay their taxes to the states, and the states pay their taxes to the federal government. The federal government does have the power, constitutional authority, to impose a tax on the states, but the taxes must be uniform, not progressive. With these changes, the Federal Reserve pushes the states out. Now, the way we stand today is that taxes, our tax monies, are actually paid to the Federal Reserve, which are privately owned corporations. They are not government agencies, as we've been told. Your money does not go to the Treasury Department, it goes to the Federal Reserve. And in turn, the Federal Reserve then loans money to the federal government to continue to spend as it wishes. All the debts and the interest are borne by the people. And it puts the Federal Reserve System in a situation of power over the federal government. Now, the example I gave is the government spends $1 trillion. If you have an expense, they spend $1 trillion, it's an immediate expenditure, the cost is immediate. If, on the other hand, the government borrows and then spends the $1 trillion, it's even worse. The expenditure is immediate, but the payment is deferred. That part sounds good. Let's say that payment is deferred for 30 years. But over that 30-year period of time, if the interest rate were 7%, that $1 trillion of expenditures now costs us $2.4 trillion, or 10%, $3.2 trillion, 15%, $4.5 trillion, or 20%, $6 trillion. Not such a good deal. In addition, there was the whole question of Social Security. Social Security was created as a savings program. People would put into this system, the money would be saved, and it'd be paid out to them in their retirement. A kind of a forced savings program, if you would. In fact, the experience is that the government couldn't keep its hands off that money. It takes the money, and spends it. If that's all it did, at least it would only be an expenditure. But in fact, what they do is they say, well, we're going to borrow that money. Effectively, they take the money, they put in an IOU, saying, well, we're going to pay it back. Who's going to pay it back? The people. In an amazing rope-a-dope, our assets are turned into further liabilities. Now, a moment talking about indentured servitude versus bondage. Indentured servitude is voluntary and it's limited in time. One serves another person for a period of time in expectation that they will then become free men and they will then be able to prosper. Bondage, on the other hand, is involuntary and is perpetual. Today, to give some indication of where our country stands, is we are still paying interest on the Civil War debts. Every year that our country continues to run a deficit or increase the debts, not only is the past debt unpaid, but new debt is put on top of it. In fact, our nation is at a point now where we now have perpetual, growing, and sustained debt. This, by any definition, meets the standard of bondage. This is not normally the way the American people think of the system, but think about it for a moment. And I think you'll come to realize that perhaps things need to be reevaluated. Now, as I mentioned, returning now to our analogy to Goldsmith, step 2 was to eliminate all competing currencies. In the history of the United States, we've had quite a number of currencies. They fall into 2 broad categories: currencies that are issued by the government and those that are issued by the banks. The constitutional ones would be gold and silver coins. In addition to those, there were a number of paper types of money that the government issued into circulation. And finally, we have the unconstitutional non-gold, non-silver coins, the ones that we know as the clad coins that we have today. In addition to that, we have issued into the economy Federal Reserve notes, which are nothing more than banknotes. And one other thing we'll talk about in a moment. So here's this wide diversity of currencies. And Goldsmith's objective is to eliminate everything but the ones that he issues. And if we take a look at the history of the United States, that is exactly what happens. All monies that were issued by the federal government have been abandoned with the exception of the unconstitutional coins, which constitute a very, very small percentage of the overall money supply. Now, a brief word about the difference between print and issue. There was great discussion about the government printing the money, but the fact is that the government prints the money or the paper currency and gives it at cost to the Federal Reserve. So for example, a $100 note would be given to the Federal Reserve, say, for a nickel, the cost of printing. The Federal Reserve then loans that back to the government for $100. The government did not actually issue the money into the economy. The Federal Reserve and its related banks does all of the issuance. The government simply does the printing, no longer the issuance. It's kind of like having a producer that has no one to sell to but a single middleman, a wholesaler. That wholesaler takes complete control over the producer. Now, in time, the scheme gets repeated. So here we have a situation where we have gold certificate and fiat banknotes that were in circulation. The gold is eliminated, but not quite. It still is out there and it still is providing a measure of value for the world's currencies, but it's no longer redeemable. They were replaced in our society by base metal coins, these clad coins, and the gold certificates were confiscated from us by an executive order of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933, 1 month after he took office. So what we're left with is a monetary consisting primarily of fiat banknotes and these coins. In time, the cycle repeats. Those who build up an excess of banknotes turn around and deposit them in the bank. Only a 10% reserve is required. And as a result, there is a possibility for yet another tenfold increase in the money supply. One only needs to keep 10% reserve. How to do this? That was the question. And the answer is, when you take your Federal Reserve notes to the bank issues you a credit. Initially, these credits might be your savings passbook account, something I was familiar with as a child. You take this little book in, they would go ahead and stamp it with the date, they would sign it, they would show the amount of money that you had deposited, and they'd show your cumulative deposits. It was simply a paper record. It amounted to a promise of redemption from the bank to redeem this credit for a banknote at some future point on demand. Over time, the savings passbook accounts gave way to a variety of instruments. Those are mostly today account statements, electronic or paper. Now we have a wide range of things called checks and traveler's checks and credit cards and debit cards and money orders. These are all nothing more than vehicles for the transfer of credits from one account to another. They are not really money. They're just simply a mechanism to transfer money between, or credits from one account to another, without actually going through paper currency in the process. Now, I call these vapors and papers. And the matrix, that the computer system that holds all these electronic credits and debits, which have no physical presence in the world, they're just simply blips, ones and zeros floating around in a global computer system. I call that the matrix. And the fiat banknotes are nothing more than papers. Now, it's my surprise most Americans to realize that today our monetary system consists of 90% vapors and 10% papers. So when we talk about the federal government printing paper, the reality is that 90% of the volume of the nation's currency is directly under control of the banks. And when the banks make loans, they increase the total quantity of our monetary supply. So recap, our monetary system is now in the hands of a privately owned set of Federal Reserve banks. These are actually corporations. They have a monopoly over the issuance of our money. Papers and vapors are the two forms of that. These are issued in the economy only if somebody borrows them. Therefore, the money supply can go up only if the debt goes up. And if we pay the debt down, the money supply goes down. It's axiomatic, it's built into the system that we have today. Now, if we take a look at this, we have the privately owned Federal Reserve banks are private, not agencies. This is a fraud that's been perpetuated on the American people. In terms of the issuance of money, we have no choice. These are fiat currencies. They have no intrinsic value whatsoever, whether they're pieces of paper or they're credits in a computer system. It is a form of indentured servitude, and the repayment in kind means that you will have perpetual the situation, because if you cannot pay off these debts with the things that you produce, say automobiles or services or eggs or cattle or chickens, you can only pay them off with the bank-issued fiat currencies. Then the only way to pay off the interest on your debt is to borrow it. It is a perpetual increase in the monetary supply. Now, the debt monetization is intrinsic, and as I mentioned, it cannot be repaid without imploding the money supply unless the system is changed. Everybody is plugged into this system. So returning to our analogy of a village, we have at the center of the village now the matrix. Also plugged into this matrix are all the corporations and other businesses that exist, as well as the governments at all levels. the United States federal government, the states government, the county governments, the local governments, or the worldwide governments in all other countries. All of these are controlled by the privately owned Federal Reserve banks in the United States. To destroy a person, a corporation, or a nation, one only needs to unplug them from the matrix. Consider what would happen tomorrow morning if your credit cards no longer work, your personal checks would not be accepted. The only money you had was the money that you had in the form of paper or coins. And perhaps even those would not be accepted. You would be able to exist for a few days, perhaps, maybe a couple of weeks, but how would you buy food eventually? How would you buy gas and travel around? How would you get to your jobs? How would you pay off your home mortgage? It is an incredible power that the banks have over the world. So let's now talk about chapter 4 of the book. How does all of this detail and facts about the monetary system affect you and your family personally? Let's investigate. Let's talk first about inflation. Now let's return to our analogy. We have a quantity of real wealth. We have a quantity of money. And at a given point in time, we have a value of $1, and we'll, for purposes, say that value is $1, because the money supply and the real wealth have a certain balance. And prices are according to that. If the money supply and the real wealth grow at the same rate, then the dollar remains $1, and prices don't go up. They remain stable. But here's what happens. If the money supply goes up more than the real wealth, then the value of the dollar goes down. And because the value of the dollar goes down, it takes more of them to buy the same car or the same home. Therefore, prices increase. It's not because of appreciation, but because of dollar devaluation. We see the effect here. So one way, the historical way to look at prices or inflation, is as an increase in prices. But this describes the symptom, not really the problem. A better definition of inflation would be this: an increase in the money supply, which results in the devaluation of the dollar and therefore an increase in prices. When banks make loans, they increase the money supply. And they do this without any government involvement whatsoever. A third way we might look at inflation is as a form of embezzlement. Now here we return to our analogy of a small village with a group of people. They have a certain amount of wealth, and I put them yellow to represent their true wealth as measured in gold. When a bank makes a loan, wealth is effectively embezzled from the savers, and it's transferred to the new borrowers. Now let's take a look at that on a personal basis. So here you are, you have a stack of money measured in dollars. Now I have those in green, Federal Reserve notes or electronic credits and debits. And I have the equivalent in gold. When that loan was made, a portion of your real value was taken from you. Your deposit slip might still, or your bank account might still say you have $10,000 on deposit, but in fact that $10,000 might only now be worth $950. That is what happens when a bank makes a loan. It's actually taking a portion of the value of your savings and lending it out. Now, it undoubtedly has some benefit for the borrower, but the borrower now becomes part of the system as well. They sign off on their deed of trust and they're pledged to labor for the bank. We see this process now repeating over and over and over again. And eventually, over a period of time, what happens is the value of your savings, your lifetime savings, is declining, even though your bank balance might be increasing. Your real wealth is going down. Inflation, as you think about it, is not some mysterious force. It's actually the transfer of your wealth to somebody else. Our monetary system is a wealth redistribution system, and the bankers make the decision how much and to whom it's redistributed. Now remember that, you can return to a debt monetization example. Debt monetization creates the debt. We have real wealth, we have a money supply, and we have debt. Anytime there's wasteful spending, this is spending or loans that are borrowed and then spent for which there is no return or comparable to return in real wealth, is in fact inflationary. So we see that the system itself guarantees the debt regardless, but then if those loans are actually made for non-productive purpose, we have a second and further problem, which is the inflation. What actually inflates the monetary supply more than real wealth? At the top of this list is war. At one point, some 80% of the federal debt has been created by one war after another. These wars are killing us. Socialism now has become probably the second generator of debt, of federal debt, and our current unfunded liabilities at the federal level are over $100 trillion. This is in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, the great socialism experiments. Cap and trade will become similar, and there are a number of other programs. And in fact, there are documents that can be obtained on the internet and a book called The Report from Iron Mountain, where the individuals will talk about the objective of spending money that will not be productive. One of those is unattainable goals. Some goal like colonizing the moon or colonizing Mars that will take more money than can possibly ever return is simply nothing more than a sinkhole for money and an inflation of the monetary supply. Now let's continue on how this impacts you. So here we are. Again, we now have these balances, the value of the dollar, your income, your savings in 401ks, your health care savings, and your savings for children's education. You have a number of investments, and you're paying a certain amount of taxes. If that monetary supply goes up greater than real things, the value of the dollar goes down. And immediately as that goes down, your income goes down, your savings go down, your investments go down, and one more thing happens. Your taxes go up. Here you'll probably not be able to see the detail in the chart. This is a chart of the value of a dollar from 1791 through 2009. It is effectively the price of gold inverted. The value of a dollar worth $1 in 1791 as of 2009 is now worth 1.83 cents. This is a 55 times decline in the value of our currency. Key events that make this happen: the War of 1812, as shown here, is the first significant drop. In here, the Coinage Act of 1834 as well, when the price of gold was reset. But look at that. That's the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, in order to fund the Civil War, increased the monetary supply or increased the federal debt by some 43 times. And in the process, we reverted to paper money. And that paper money rapidly devalued to 45 cents on the dollar, as shown in the chart here. The economy, unfortunately, was robust enough to eventually bounce back, and we had some presidents to try to get things back in line. Here we see the next two major events. In 1933, by executive order, as I mentioned before, FDR confiscates the gold in the United States, and then he immediately turns around and devalues the paper currency that he has just forced people to take. This is accomplished by changing the price of gold from $20 to $35 an ounce. Or to flip that around, look at that another way, the value of the paper currency went from 1/20th of an ounce to 1/35th of an ounce. That's that first plunge. The second plunge occurs when Nixon takes us off the gold standard. I don't believe that Nixon was evil in doing this. I think he had no choice. At this point in time, people were no longer able in the United States to redeem their paper for gold. That had been eliminated by FDR as well. But foreigners and foreign countries were able to do so when there was a flow of gold out of the country, and there probably was no choice but to do this. All the momentum had been put into place before Nixon. Take another look at your effect on you. Now this chart goes from the year 2000 to 2009. And those three lines, again, were probably hard to read the labels, but they represent, I'll mention here in a second. At the starting point, there's $100,000, and let's assume that you raise a 5% annual raise. The green line in that chart represents what your perception of your income is as measured in paper, currency, or in credits. It's climbing. And by 2009, it appears that the income is $155,000 a year, or up 55%. If we actually take a look at the value of that income as measured in gold, the income has declined to $42,296, a drop in 57% in 9 years. That's because the value of the currency plunged by nearly 73% in that 9-year period of time when measured again in gold. Now let's take a look at savings. Let's suppose in the year 2000 you had saved $250,000. You were being cautious, you had it in a money fund, and you were making 3% interest on your money. The blue line at the top represents how that looked to you over the time. By the year 2009, that $250,000 had grown to $334,000 as measured in papers. But if we now take a look at it in gold, it's dropped to $91,000, a 64% decline in the value of your savings. Let's take a look at a savings program. We'll now assume that you start with $250,000. You have an income of $100,000 a year, growing 5% a year, and that you save 10% of your income every year. At the end of the year 2009, it appears that you have savings of $448,000, or up 79%, a very significant amount of money. In gold measured dollars, your savings, all of this effort, all these savings, and including 10% of your income, you still have lost 51% or 49% of the value of your wealth. Now we can take a look at the value of investments. Let's suppose that you put your money instead in stocks. The Dow Jones Industrial Average in the year 2000 was 13,595, and by the year 2009 it had dropped to 10,063, down 26%. If we take a look at it actually in gold, it had dropped to $7,566. At that point in time, gold had climbed to about $1,200 an ounce, or in other words, one could buy the Dow Jones Industrial Average with about 5 gold coins. Now, had you either been scared out of the marketplace or forced out of the marketplace at the bottom, then you would have had a very significant hit to your wealth. You'd be down 58% in actual value. Now let's take a look at a home. You know, people consider homes to be investments. Here's a home that in 1950 was manufactured and sold for $30,000. And by the year 2009, it was worth $1.5 million on paper. In gold, now that represents, if you were to sell that home, it represents a $1,470,000 gain, right? It's certainly taxable as capital gains. Now, homes are immune from some capital gains. There are some benefits, but if this were a corporation or some other form of investment, it would fully be taxable as capital gains. If we take a look at this in gold and gold constant dollars, the value of that home was hardly moved, maybe by about $17,000, $18,000, $19,000, from $30,000 to $49,000. That's it. What we considered to be appreciation was in fact dollar devaluation or inflation. So the government has, first off, the role of creating that inflation, taking that money and that value from us, and then it comes back for a second dip by calling that income and demanding that we pay taxes on our devalued currency. We'll take one other look at taxes. Now there's the taxes you see, you're familiar with, the income tax, the Social Security tax, disability tax. There's a lot of other taxes perhaps you see but aren't quite as on top of sales taxes, but you also have taxes on your phone, taxes on your hotel, you have usage fees and permit fees and licensing fees, and on and on and on. But these are taxes that you pay yourself directly. As if it were bad enough, it turns out that when you buy a product or a service, all of the taxes that are paid by the corporation that you buy from are rolled into the cost of that product or that service. They pay all the same taxes you do, plus more, such as inventory tax, and they pay withholding taxes and so forth. All of those taxes are rolled into the price of those products or services, and that's even before sales tax is added on top of them. All of those roll up. Furthermore, all of the organizations that they buy from and their taxes roll into that company's taxes roll into your purchase. The other thing I would comment on is the war debts. These war debts are absolutely killing us. This is a direct impact on you and your families. Here are periods of time. During the Civil War, this chart you may not be able to read very well, but you can barely see little tiny blips on the left-hand side of this. That's the debt that the federal government had prior to the Civil War. In a period of 3 or 4 short years, the total federal debt climbed by 43 times. He may have saved the Union, but Lincoln effectively bankrupted the country. To put that in today's parameters, let's suppose that by the end of Barack Obama's term that the national federal debt had climbed from, say, $10 trillion to $430 trillion. And one gets some perspective on the magnitude of the increase in this debt. A second one that we can take a look at is World War I. That was an 8 times increase in the national debt. Now again, an 8 times increase means that we had spent in that period of time 7 times more than the entire cumulative debt of the country from its foundation until that point in time. World War II increased our federal debt by 5 times. We have Reagan, who fought the Cold War with Russia, the Soviet Union. That cost us a 3 times increase in our debt. And we have Bush fighting the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, a 3.7 times increase in our debt. Once again, before he came into office, we had, say, $1 of debt. We now have $3.70 of debt. A mammoth increase. What you can do, first, is to learn. Study the monetary system. It's vitally important to you and your family, and it's important to your nation. Read the book, and if you live in the Bay Area in California, there are free seminars that you can come to learn more. This being the first of 3. The second seminar will talk about the history and exactly how this evolves in the United States. And the final chapters talk about solutions and more details about what you can do to get involved to help turn things around. It is logical for you to use the knowledge you gain about the monetary system to protect yourself and your family, and you should do so. Although the book contains no personal financial advice, and I'm certainly not a financial advisor and I do not provide personal financial advice, I believe that an understanding of the monetary system will help you in your challenge to try and keep ahead. But protecting yourself is not enough. Being on the high point of the Titanic does not save you. We must protect our country. And we must do this together. This must be a united effort. Toward that end, you can also help me spread the word. The story of the monetary system will not be told to the children through the schools. It will not go through television to the people and the masses sitting on their couches. It will not be told to us by Wall Street or Washington, D.C. The only way this information can be disseminated is through the people itself, and through people like me who can collect this information and pass it on. So please, help me, spread this knowledge. Pass the book along. Get your friends, get copies of the books for your friends. Have them come to the seminars. Use the booklets. And shortly this video and possibly others will be available for your use. And then work through local organizations in communicating, coordinating, and cooperating among like-minded people to bring about change. And then finally, all of this knowledge and all this energy must be directed toward the electoral process so we can begin to make changes in our legislation and our economic system. We need to vet our candidates to make sure they understand these issues. Just saying you're going to reduce the debt is not enough. They must understand the monetary system. They must be committed to reforming it. We have to figure that out in the process of electing who we choose. Once they're elected, we need to monitor them and make sure they're on task in moving forward, and that we support them when they do. I wish to thank you for your time. I encourage you to read the book. You can come to the website, which is www.silentnomorepublications.com, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much for your time.